Lily here to give you my honest review on Marvel's Doctor Strange. Like many, I sort of felt the need to boycott this film when it was in theaters. Why? Well, social pressures mostly. My friend said that it was a bad film on principle, and rather than argue on a point I had no idea about, I just shut up and let them grump and grouse for months on end while the trailers played in theaters and on television. I mean, after all, I am a novice when it comes to the Marvel comics. My extent of Marvel comes from the cinematic universe. I was born a DC Comics baby, and up until 2012, I wasn't that interested in Marvel beyond Spider-Man. Well, since the 2012 release of The Avengers, let's just say I've seen most, if not all, of the films in theater. The exception would be Doctor Strange. I finally sat down to watch this movie, and I felt a bit uneasy as the opening started. I mean, after all, this was supposed to be a terrible movie, right? White man goes to place and becomes best at thing. That's what the whole trope of this film was supposed to be, right? Right? Well, much to my surprise, besides some minor confusion in the beginning when the bad guy of this film, played by Mads Mikkelsen, aka my husband, cuts off a guy's head, I found myself rather enjoying the sort of offbeat pacing of the film. It took me off guard, really, because it feels so different from your Age of Ultrons and Civil Wars. The feeling of this film reminded me of the good old days of Iron Man, the Incredible Hulk, Thor, and Captain America. This was an introduction film done proper. No introducing an important character in the middle of an otherwise busy team-based story. This was just a simple film introducing us to Stephen Strange, an arrogant doctor who has every right to be arrogant. Stephen Strange, played by Benedict Cumberbatch, is the best at what he does, to some chagrin of his fellow surgeons and medical staff. But I mean, come on. The guy's overconfident because he's the best at what he does. It isn't like he's really mean-spirited or an asshole. The closest thing to mean-spirited or asshole we really get is after his accident, and after who knows how many months of surgeries, physical therapy, and attempting to find someone who would be willing to try sketchy treatment options. In a fit of anger and self-loathing, Stephen snaps at his not-girlfriend, barely lover, who's been helping and supporting him through his entire ordeal. Unlike most movies where this happens, she doesn't really break down and cry or even yell at him. She simply says goodbye and leaves. Good on you, girl. I think we're all a little tired of the weepy woman trope and the yelling at disabled people tropes in films. They're awkward. Stephen is given proof that a man suffering from massive spinal damage, which had led to being almost entirely paralyzed, had in fact regained his ability to walk. Even with the physical proof, Stephen finds it hard to believe and seeks the man out. Turns out, this is a man who Stephen had refused to treat because he was supposed to be untreatable. But rather than being an asshole, as this man so easily could be, he tells Stephen the truth. He tells him that he went all over looking for answers until he finally came upon a place in Nepal. A place where people from all over the world usually end up looking for healing in one form or another. He claims that the person in charge didn't cure his physical ailments, but rather his spiritual ones. Stephen, of course, thinks that sounds hokey, because it does, but decides, screw it, what do I got to lose? So after spending every last cent he had on getting to Nepal, Stephen seeks out this Comitage, where he might be cured. He asks around as best he can and wanders the city tirelessly. He's eventually cornered by a group of guys wanting to rob him, insisting that he give up his watch after he tells them he doesn't have any money. He tries to resist, but ends up as no match due to his severely damaged hands. Luckily for Stephen, someone had overheard him asking around for this special place and steps in to rescue him. This man assures Stephen that it is real, and that he too had once come searching for it in his time of need. He returns Stephen's watch to him, which has sadly been smashed during the scuffle. Injured and tired, Stephen follows the man to their destination, making a few comments that the stranger kindly points out are rude and insensitive, to which Stephen immediately looks surprised and rather ashamed, like the thought had never even crossed his mind. The stranger tells him to be respectful upon meeting the Ancient One. Upon entering the Comitage, Strange sees a man sitting behind a table, who he immediately begins talking to. He attempts several times to express his thanks for being seen, though he's interrupted when his coat is taken, and again when he is offered tea. He then learns that the man was not the Ancient One, but rather a woman who he'd only given a glance in passing. Let's slow down a moment. Weren't some of the big issues of this movie that Stephen Strange was an arrogant asshole who really didn't take any of this cultural mumbo-jumbo seriously? Well, since he's been in Nepal, he's been pretty respectful, even apologetic when he's told he's being rude. And throughout the course of his training, it isn't so much that he thinks it's fake, because he doesn't. He just has a logical scientist's mind. He has trouble letting go of what he knows, and what he's learned before, and letting his own pride go. He's a man of science trying to adjust to the knowledge that magic is real, and he's using it. Also, I remember another huge issue with the film was the Ancient One. Not that it was a woman, but that it was a white woman. Okay, let me say this first and foremost. I understand. They shouldn't have whitewashed the Ancient One. I agree, but I'm also glad that she was a white woman. Let me explain. Throughout the movie, beyond scaring the utter shit out of Stephen and convincing him that magic does in fact exist, the Ancient One has no purpose. Not really. We learn along with Stephen that there must always be a grand sorceress or sorcerer to protect the world from magical invasion, and that the Ancient One is not the first. Okay, so there have been many grand sorceresses and Ancient Ones before. Cool. And since this is a place and a mini society where all from all over the world are welcome, it isn't that hard to believe that the grand sorceress or sorcerer could be any color of the rainbow. But let me explain why I'm glad she's a white woman. She's not important. Throughout the course of the film, the Ancient One is nothing more than a looming presence in the background. She only really comes forward a few times, once to not so kindly force Stephen to push himself harder, though he's probably pushing himself harder than any of the other new students, and another time to explain that if he fucks up, she won't hesitate to lock his ass up in a mirror dimension where he'll be all alone. This threat isn't even because of anything Stephen might do, but rather the Ancient One's own past failings. She seems to have a lot of those. Not so good at your job, are you, babe? Everything else that Stephen learns, he learns from his friend Quan, the librarian, who he's constantly attempting to make laugh, and Morda, who he asks questions and trains with. Stephen shows respect for their society even though he doesn't really understand it, and really wants to. That's Stephen's biggest downfall. He wants to know everything right fucking now, damn it. But even with that drive, Stephen isn't malicious. He just wants to understand as best he can. When Stephen is caught messing around with magic he shouldn't be, his two friends try to tell him how dangerous it is, how it's unnatural, and there will be consequences for using magic like that. Stephen tries to explain himself while also asking why. The book has no warning labels. If it's so dangerous, shouldn't there be warnings? But before the three can get any further into it, my husband, the bad guy, returns to cause trouble, because that's all he really seems to do. Now, I'm not trying to shit on Mads Mikkelsen's performance, because I love him, and I've yet to find a film that he isn't absolutely brilliant in. And I'm not really trying to shit on the character either, but he's sort of underwhelming. I guess all villains in introduction films are supposed to be, because the hero isn't really at grand hero status yet, but I don't know. This seems like a pretty insignificant bad guy trying to do major bad guy things. I wish that we'd been given more information on this character beyond he's lost everything and came to learn before going rogue and taking a bunch of people with him. Okay, cool, I get it. But I don't really feel anything. I don't feel the villain's urgency, his apathy, and I really want to. Because Mads Mikkelsen, damn, is this boy emoting urgency and apathy. Well, Stephen is pulled into a fight which he isn't really prepared for, but manages to stay alive by thinking quick on his feet and flying by the seat of his pants. He seems to finally join the attacking Caecilius on the same grounds when an ancient artifact relic chooses him. And it turns out that that relic is a quirky red cape with tons of personality. No joke. I think the cape is my favorite character. After seemingly getting the upper hand, Stephen has a heart-to-heart with Caecilius, who informs him that the Ancient One pulls her powers from the Dark Dimension, and that is how she keeps herself alive. Stephen doesn't want to believe it, but he's read the books. He knows how that magic works, and he can't help but put two and two together. But of course, when Stephen is distracted, he ends up getting stabbed. Again, being quick on his feet, Stephen promptly gets himself to the hospital, and his former not-girlfriend quickly jumps to help him out. Of course, while she's keeping Stephen's body alive, Stephen's having an astral plane battle, where he's just as equally outmatched as he was before. When his body starts to crash, not-girlfriend gives him a jolt, which Stephen realizes affects his astral projection too, sending his enemy flying. He promptly pops back in and tells her to turn it up and do it again, before grabbing his attacker and forcing all 260 jolts into his attacker, who promptly dies. Once back in his body, Stephen attempts to explain a little, while also apologizing for being an asshole. He then apologizes again when he says he has to go, proving to not-girlfriend that what he's saying is true by showing her the portal he opened in the mop closet. When Stephen gets back to London, it's to find his attacker is dead, and Caecilius is gone. Morda arrives, and shortly thereafter, so does the Ancient One. Both make comments about how the Cloak of Levitation chose him. Stephen explains what happened, and the Ancient One decides to elect him master in defending their London outpost, to which Stephen quickly turns down. While passive-aggressively arguing with the Ancient One, he calls her out on drawing her long life and magic from the Dark Dimension. She warns him to be careful with what he says because he might not know what he's talking about. Caecilius returns and an all-out fight begins. Stephen attempts to lock them all in the mirror dimension so that Caecilius can't affect the real world, but realizes that this might have been a bad idea when they can still be killed there. The fight feels like a losing battle when the Ancient One steps in and in doing so proves that she does in fact take her magic from the Dark Dimension. She tries to explain to Caecilius that Dormammu's promises of eternal life mean nothing, and that it's nothing but torment, but he refuses to listen and they fight. And in sacrificing one of his own men, Caecilius manages to stab the Ancient One and send her crashing through a portal to the real world, where Stephen and Mordred rush her to the hospital. When Stephen realizes that the Ancient One is dying, he searches for her in the astral plane, finding her looking out over the cityscape. He tries to urge her back to her body, but she refuses. She tries once again to explain that she never could heal anyone, but rather that the individuals could heal themselves using magic. This idea appeals to Stephen, who wants nothing more than to heal his hands and go back to being a surgeon. But despite knowing that he isn't ready for a fight, he knows he can't go back, and with that, the Ancient One dies. Can we talk about the Ancient One again for 1 minute? Remember how I said I didn't mind her being a white woman? This is why. Firstly, she really is unimportant throughout most of the film, minus 1 or 2 moments, and then she dies. She's proven to be nothing more than a failure and a bit of a sellout. The path to hell is paved with good intention. That is exactly the best way to describe her, and because of that, I'm glad she's white. I would have hated to see a person of color pushed into this role as it is. If it had been a bigger role, where we got to know her, were then let down because she was a sellout, and then maybe she had a bit of redemption, yeah, I could get behind a person of color in the role. But as it is, no. She's bland, two-dimensional, unimportant, barely makes a difference in death. I find it far more believable for her choices to come from a white person. Not to say that people of color can't fuck up and make mistakes. But we don't need that sort of representation in media. So I'm sorry if the Ancient One not being a person of color bothered you. Your feelings are valid, but for me, I'm glad she wasn't. After the Ancient One is pronounced dead, Stephen returns to Comatage, where he confronts his friend, who is having, for lack of a better term, a struggle with his faith. Despite that, Stephen tries to assure him that even though she made bad choices, the Ancient One was doing what she thought was right, and that they still had a job to do. The two head for Hong Kong, the last line of defense to save the Earth, only to find that it's already fallen. Stephen decides to take a risk, and using the advanced time-warping magic he'd read about, forces time to reverse. They fight Caecilius as the city rights itself, and even Kwong is brought back to life. But Caecilius gets the upper hand, and the Dark Dimension continues to bleed into our reality. Stephen realizes that he can't stop it, and realizes that time doesn't exist in the Dark Dimension, so he decides to bring time to it. Sacrificing himself, Stephen begins a time loop where he confronts Dormammu over and over, dying over and over in terrible ways, claiming that either they reach a compromise or they continue living the moment over and over again. Eventually, Dormammu, having no understanding of time, asks him what he wants, and Stephen says he'll break the time loop if Dormammu will take Caecilius and his followers with him and leave Earth alone forever. Dormammu agrees and the battle is brought to an end. Stephen puts the city back together, and Morda comments that they'd ended it by breaking their rules just like the Ancient One, and that the reckoning will come. He leaves, no longer believing in anything that he'd been trained in, leaving Stephen and Kwong alone in Comatage. Stephen decides to keep learning and remain defending Earth now that the Sorcerer Supreme is gone, knowing that he can't go back to being who he was before. He may not have wanted to be a hero, but he's come to accept that that is exactly what he is. So, overall, I really liked this movie. It was a bit of fresh air from your Age of Ultrons and your Civil Warses. It didn't bog me down with too much information, or too many characters, and that was a welcome change. The film was good. The effects were amazing, the acting on point, and though the music will be forgettable like it is with all Marvel movies, it was good in the moment. I think this film got a bad rap. I'm not saying that it was perfect and that it didn't make mistakes, but I think it was too harshly judged. It had a pretty diverse cast when you really think about the fact that the main cast was like 3 people. You've got Stephen, who's a white guy, Kwong, who's Asian, and Morda, who's black. I don't know, that's pretty diverse. I know a lot of people complained that Stephen was cast white, but I really don't think that mattered. I don't think it would have mattered what color he was, whether white, black, Asian, or anything else. This really wasn't the story of white guy goes and becomes best at thing trope, at least not in this film. That may be the case with other films featuring Strange, but as of right now, he's subpar at best. He's just really smart. He's not all that great at magic, just smart, a bit lucky, and isn't afraid to break the rules because he's willing and ready to take the consequences. I think really the only complaint I have with this film is that we don't get to know a lot about Stephen or the other characters. For such a simple film with such a simple basic plot, we hear and see more about the plot than we do about the characters. We learn just enough to distinguish them, kind of like them, but nothing else. This is where I'm really hoping sequel films will help. Not that I hated learning about the magic, or other dimensions, but I wanted to know more about the characters. So in my opinion, this was a pretty good movie. And I'm a tiny bit disappointed that I didn't get to see it in theaters, even if the visual effects would have made me throw up. Oh my god, can we talk about those, cutscenes for a second? Best cutscenes I've seen in a Marvel movie in a long time.